This is an ABC podcast.
Family photos weren't a big thing when Roland Breckwoldt was growing up, but there is one of him aged about 4. He's standing at the edge of a rock above Lake Parramatta, wearing a straw cowboy hat and holding a long rope looped in one hand and a lasso noose in the other. Roland fell in love with the idea of being a cowboy and with horses right back then as a little kid. And as soon as he could, at just 15, he left Sydney and headed way up north to the Queensland Gulf country. On the vast cattle stations there, he worked as a ringer, catching bullocks by the tail, sleeping in a swag under the stars, and working out who he was in the midst of some eccentric characters and the majesty and extremity of the outback. His memoir of that time is called The New Ringer. Hi, Roland.
Hello.
Roland, this love of horses, as I say, goes way back. It was a big part of your childhood. Tell me how you first got to know a man named Arthur and his stallion Lordly.
Yes, well, Robbie McCann and I used to make our way down to a dam where we caught carp and threw them all back until we got some goldfish. And we walked past this little shack, a Wern's shack, a 2-room shack that we used to walk past. And there was this very unusual man in jodhpurs with a moustache and a bit of a military look. And we were terrified of him. We circled widely. But one day we went past and he said hello and we said hello and he invited us in, and it was an amazing scene. He was occupied the kitchen where he had a couch and it cooked and everything, and next door this giant stallion, this 17-hand stallion lived.
Not next door, like in the next room, yes?
In the next room. Yeah, he used to stick his head out and talk to us lordly, and we became such firm friends, you know. We were there all the time.
So
all the time, every
was
weekend.
This stallion living in the cottage with Arthur?
Well, see, Arthur and Lordly had a wonderful life, you see. Arthur used to travel around with Lordly all around Sydney as far as Cowra. In fact, he was known as the gypsy breeder, and he'd go wherever there were mares, you see. So they had a wonderful symbiotic relationship. Arthur collected the stud fees and Lordly had infinite female variety. So
quite the life for both of them.
For both of them, yeah.
And how would you and your mates spend your time when you were hanging out with them?
Making jaffles and listening to endless Slim Whitman and others on his wind-up radio over and over again. So, and then making jaffles and talking to Arthur. So it was just great, yeah.
Your parents wouldn't let you get your own horse, but your father was very experienced with horses. He'd been in the German cavalry in the First World War. Why was he awarded the Iron Cross?
Well, what he told me was on the Russian front as a forward scout, and he was able to cross this river to get to the other side to see his enemy positions. But getting back, he was cut off. So he had to go along the river, and he came to this iron trestle bridge, you know, just the sleepers and nothing else, because it only had to carry a railway and no vehicles. And he figured that if he tried to lead his horse across, it wouldn't be all sort of keyed up and attentive. So he rode his horse across, stepping from frozen sleeper to frozen sleeper. Now, I believe that now because I know that a horse will do things with a rider on it that it won't do otherwise. So I know that, but for that he was awarded the Iron Cross and he was greatly promoted, and that's the reason when the Third Reich started to militarise and Hitler started coming to power, that was one reason that he left Germany. He wasn't going to fight another war.
The other reason, though, was your mother.
Yes.
How had they met each other?
Well, this is if you think about it, it takes a little bit of working out, but people will get on this very quickly. My father fell in love with his wife's doctor's daughter, who was 19 years his junior, and they eloped. And my father left his wife and his two children, a boy, Helmut, and his daughter, Gisa, and eloped with my mother. He wasn't yet divorced, so they lived in sin when it was a sin in Shanghai.
In Shanghai? What were they doing there?
The Germans have this sort of love-hate relationship, many of them, with order on one side and then the sort of diversity and wilderness and difference on the other, which is, of course, why so many people like Australia. German people have come to Australia, and for other reasons. But so there was a big German community in Shanghai. There was a Jewish community, an English community, and a big German community. And they were the glory years for my parents. They were the absolute glory years.
Are there photos of them from that time?
There's a beautiful photograph of my mother, which was probably on the wedding day, because just under it is the imprint of the photographer there, and others of them in their riding gear. And so my love of horses, it's interesting these days with more information coming about genetics and how much of our behaviour is actually environmentally determined. Mine, growing up at North Rocks and horses everywhere, and I couldn't have one. But also that genetic aspect of my father early, and my mother. My mother's family had a big farm in Schleswig-Holstein in Germany.
So they were living there together and managed to get married in Shanghai. How did things change for them once Japan invaded China?
Yeah, well, they had to get out. I have photographs of bomb craters in Bubbling Wells Road where they lived, and ironically enough, the safest, being Caucasians, the safest place was Japan.
What did they do there? What were they doing for work?
Well, my father got part-time work repairing temples. He was an architect, but also had quite strong building skills. So there. I don't know how the meeting took place, but my father met a Mr. McFarlane. I don't know if my father had a deliberate meeting with him or just met him, but he went home that night to my mother. They were going to go to Argentina, you see. That's the only place they knew. But they met this Mr. McFarlane. My father went home that night to my mother and said, if they're all like that, we're going to go to Australia. Seriously, one person.
How had Mr. McFarlane behaved? What had he done to make such an impression on your dad?
I don't know. I don't know, and I've tried to find out, but there's nothing available. And but was he tall, charismatic, or just a good bloke?
Maybe
I don't know.
He was just kind or encouraging. Yeah,
maybe. Yeah.
So they came, your mother and father then came to Australia in early 1938, and then, of course, war breaks out and Australia is at war with Germany. What happened on Christmas Eve 1941?
Well, it started coming to a head when the mini-subs attacked Sydney Harbour. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and not long after the mini-subs made their attack in Sydney Harbour. And, that was early. It was early December 1941. So then tempers, attitudes really hardened towards alien people. And my father, you had to know him. He was interviewed by the security police on the, I think the 20th of December. He was interviewed by them, and they asked him, went tete-a-tete and everything like that. They asked him whether he considered himself a good German. Well, there was an easy way out of that. All he had to say was he hated Hitler, he hated the Third Reich, and he left in 1933 to get away from him. And all that was true. That's all he had to say. But instead, he made the point that being a good German was a precondition of being a good Australian. Like he was talking about being a good person. But the security agents fixed on the good German.
It's not, those interviews are not the time for complexities of national character.
And sophistry, sophistry.
It's not Socratic dialogue, but just, of course I'm not a good German in that sense. So bring us then to Christmas Eve. What happened?
Yeah, it was Germans celebrate Christmas on Christmas Eve, and there's a little ritual about the kids aren't allowed to see the Christmas tree and the presents, and then as the Christmas candles are being lit, my parents burst into song with the German carol, Come All You Children. And Seriously, they just burst into song when the door burst open in their flat at Bondi, and he was arrested. He was let out on Christmas Eve, yeah. So there you go.
So he was taken to an internment camp in the outskirts of Sydney first off.
Holsworthy was still an internment camp base from the First World War, so he's held there, yeah.
And your mum was left alone in this flat in Bondi with your big sister, who was just a toddler or so at the time.
She was 3 years of age and remembers the Christmas Eve incident very well, of course.
And
yeah.
so what did your mum decide to do?
Look, she looked at every possibility, but in the end, she sort of decided she wanted to be, for Angela's sake and her sake, to be in the internment camp. So she went and saw the police, the security police, and said she wanted to be interned. And my mother was a pretty highly strung person, and when she threw a tantrum, it was true tantrum.
So the security police wouldn't have argued too much?
They didn't argue. They could sense it all coming. They could see it all coming. So they said, yep, okay. So they went into the internment camp, and then from there we moved to Tatura. Tatura was chosen in Western Victoria because it was a long way from the coast, harder for people to escape, and of course it had extremely good water supplies. So that's why Tatura in Western Victoria was chosen.
So you were actually born while your parents were still in this internment camp in February 1944. How did your mum later describe the consequences of that?
Well, my mother and father always said, we wanted you born in Tatura so you'd be born an Australian. So I thought I'd been taken out of the internment camp and born in a hospital in Tatura. But recently, when I went down there to speak to people in Tatura, which was a great thrill, of course, to go to Tatura to speak, place of my birth, they took me around to all the old prison camps, and we worked out that I was indeed born inside, behind barbed wire, as my mother, that I was born in Waranga Prison Hospital in Camp Number 1, which is about 13 or 14 kilometres from Camp Number 3 where they lived. So my mother must have been transported there to a bigger hospital in the camp, and I was born. So I was in fact born in the prison camp. So whenever I was young, I was a bit of a wild child at times, and I used to get in trouble with the neighbours for all sorts of reasons. And when they complained to my mother would always say, poor boy, he can't help it. He was born behind barbed wire. And I can see now it was an excuse for me, but it was also a very convenient excuse for her.
Or maybe some truth to it. Who knows?
I think there could have been. Now I think about it, maybe she was just having a bit of a dig back at them that, she had been in an internment camp. I think of all those things now, the possibilities.
After your family were released, where did you head next?
Well, they let my father out on May the 14th, 1945. He was allowed out on parole, and he checked out all his former people he'd worked with, and the bank manager who'd supported them when they first came out connected him with a Dr. Wern, who had a huge estate at North Rocks, where in fact Lordley, and had some cottages on it. And my father managed to get one of those cottages on the basis that he fixed it up and repaired it and painted it and got free rent. So he went there for three months, and then we all joined him. It would have been 15 months of age.
It was part of a piggery. It was on the
and
what did your mum say about this new home?
Well, you see, my father was terrified about bringing her there because they both came from very wealthy families in Germany, but although they were both estranged on account of the elopement. But he was terrified. But when she arrived, she says, I like this bloody place, which was very typical of my mother. She really wanted to fit in. My father didn't ever try to fit in, really. He couldn't. But my mother was very gregarious and made a real attempt to get on with everybody. And, my mother was a very successful person.
So they went about then building, your father, with your help, built your own home to move into. What stands out in your mind? What are your memories when you think back to what that place looked like or felt like?
Pretty good memories, but you have to take into account I was my father's slave. I really was. He used to inveigle me to go by telling him we would catch lizards and stuff under the sheets of fibro. But if I'm a bit slow talking or a bit slow on the uptake, you'll know it was all the red lead paint and the stuff that I was painting the house
Goodness.
with. And yeah, look, and cutting fibro with these big, old fibro cutters, cutting it into shape. So between the 3-year-old Roland and my 55-year-old father, he was 52 when I was born. But he did it. It was a tiny little place, tiny little.
What was unusual about what was inside?
It's incredible, really, that even in all that disruption, he bought a lot of very valuable antiques and furniture from China and Japan. They got to Australia. I don't know who the Good Samaritan was who stored them and looked after them while they were interned. There's somewhere along the line there is a person or persons I don't know who must have very kindly stored a huge amount of furniture. So it all came out. The house inside was quite nice, but small.
A little fibro shack full of priceless Japanese and Chinese antiques.
Yeah, I still have them. We still all have them all, yeah.
Did the family speak German at home, Roland?
Yes, unfortunately, yeah. But fortunately now, because any poor German tourist that comes within earshot gets me practising my German. But, look, my father tolerated no English at all and at home. And
why was that unfortunate at the time?
Oh, look, I wanted to fit in. I was a kid. I was a child. I wanted to be Australian. I hated my name. Can you imagine a one-day-old baby called Roland Johannes Breckwoldt? Can you picture that? So I hated my name. I wish they'd call me Brad or Russell or...
And the fact that your family were German, I mean, I guess this was a time when there were so many European immigrants post-war coming to Australia, but was there a different tang with the fact that your name was German and your family were German?
Oh, yeah, look, there were boundaries. At North Rocks at that time, of course now it's a highly dense suburbanised area, but it was all bush and there was just one road called North Rocks Road and the odd avenue off it. Ours was Statham Avenue. But the first subdivisions were happening and the first sort of middle-class commuters were buying the little blocks of land that were allowed to be subdivided along North Rocks Road. So there were returned soldiers amongst them, and who hated Germans, and there were people who were related to people who'd been killed in the war and everything like that. So there was a bit of a social boundary, but the bush held no boundaries, and so I did make friends with a couple of kids. Robbie McCann, the McCann family was very friendly towards us. She had a sister who was married to an Italian who'd been a prisoner of war, so they were more empathetic towards us. And I had my friends. I was, probably inherited some of my mother's gregariousness, so I made friends fairly easy. So within that social boundary, the bush had no boundaries, so that became sort of my home.
You also made friends with creatures from the bush, particularly lizards. Where did you keep your bearded dragon?
Well, I kept it under my jumper because...
Did you get spiky, Roland? How comfortable are bearded dragons?
No, but look, I had all sorts of pets. Funnily enough, my father was a distant authoritarian man, but my sister told me, he never told me this, but my sister Angela, who's 7 years older than I am, told me that when he was a child, his very, very strict, very wealthy industrialist parents, he came home with 3 white mice a kid had given him at school, and his parents made him drown them in the jar.
Oh, gosh.
So, while my father was not a mentor towards my animal collecting, he didn't stop me, and I think that's the reason. So I collected everything you could possibly imagine. And he never stopped me. He didn't help me. He didn't sort of help me make cages or anything, but he never said no to anything that I brought home.
Didn't make you take the lizard out from under your jumper?
No, and the snakes, and I had snakes and all sorts of things as a kid, yeah.
Your mum wasn't always as tolerant towards animals. What happened at the koala enclosure on a family visit to Taronga Zoo, Roland?
My parents used to embarrass me all the time. I think that's part of growing up, isn't it?
I think it is.
But my parents were was super. They were really
To the next
skilled at it,
degree.
you know. My father speaking German about 120 decibels in the bus, just to show he was a proud German. It would have me crawling under the seat. But my mother, we went to the zoo, you see, and the koalas and they were on this concrete floor, and they had forked sticks holding their eucalypt leaves, but they were all dozing. They were all drunk on eucalypt leaves, and they were sound asleep, trying to sleep off their hangover from eucalypt leaves, sound asleep. And my mother hadn't travelled all the way from North Rocks on the train to Central, and then the Wynyard, and then the ferry across to see dozing koalas. So there was this pile of bricks nearby where they'd been trying to repair the enclosure. So she got this half brick. There's all these people standing around looking. She got this half brick and aimed at one of these dozing koalas. Well, it didn't go high enough, of course, to do it, but it hit the fork and then rattled across the floor, and people.
So she tried to peg the brick at the koala itself.
No, not really a koala, but just create some noise and mayhem to make it wake it up. Yeah. And
I shouldn't laugh, but I can imagine your horror as a child.
Oh, my horror, and people around staring at her and sort of coughing and telling her that she was irresponsible, and oh dear, yeah.
You left school young at 14 and were working first off as a lab technician, which is a job that your father got you at the University of Sydney. But then a letter arrived in January 1960 that set you on a completely new path. Who was it from?
That was from my stepbrother, Helmut, one of the ones my father left behind. So here's the futility of war, isn't it? Up till 1945, Australians and the Allies were shooting the Germans, and they were shooting back. They were beating each other up, right? Then after the war, there was a massive lack of labour, and there weren't enough 10-pound POMs taking up the issue. So by 1950, the gate was open to Germans to come to Australia to help nation building. Now, isn't that crazy? Isn't it just so crazy? So my brother was on the first trip. So I was 9 and he was 28 when he first came out in 1953. He came out in one of the first ships to Australia, and he came out, and I thought the world of him. And then he was indentured to work, and he worked at building the Wallerawang power station just outside Lithgow. And I think there was some surplus materials there that he offered to get for my father, but I think there was some transport costs involved in getting it there. My father refused to pay them. They had an almighty row, and then all of a sudden he disappeared out of my life. And my parents, I lived in the classic nuclear family where all emotions were dangerous, and nothing was said. Nothing was said. He just was there one day and gone the next. But all of a sudden a letter arrived from Helmut. It was just after Christmas. A letter arrived from Helmut. He'd obviously wanted to make peace or make contact again. And my father must have been pleased because he read the letter out. And he was a builder in Monto. They had a corner store in Monto, which Gwen, his wife...
This is up in Queensland,
yeah, up in Queensland, central Queensland. And he just happened to say that one of the jobs he was doing at the moment was building a homestead and a cattle station. My decision was instant. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating here. It was instant. I just wrote to him that night and said, I'm coming.
This was going to be your great chance to go and work with horses out on a station. How do you remember feeling setting off on this great adventure on the train, saying goodbye to your mum and dad?
I felt fantastic. I felt absolutely wonderful. I'd bought myself a great big 303-25 rifle, huge thing.
Was just on the train with you?
Yeah, those were the days. Yeah, on the train next to me, uncovered. I might have had it. I did have it in a rifle carrying case, true. But yeah, in those days, yeah, no trouble at all. But my mother was driving by then. My father never drove. She had an old bomb Singer with the 2 seats in the front and the Dixie seat behind. They opened like a boot, and you could sit in there. So I sat in there, and my mum and dad and me. And when we got on the train at Granville to go into Central with my father, it was the only time in my whole life that I remember him saying something warm or tender towards my mother. He said, "Son," he said, "Roland, wave goodbye. Make sure you wave goodbye to your mother. And I did. But, you know, I feel get teary about it these days. I wonder what she was thinking, what they were thinking, you know.
You're listening to Conversations with Sarah Konoski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app. Or go to abc.net.au/conversations.
So, Roland, you arrived in Monto in central Queensland, where your German half-brother was living with his wife Gwen, who ran the local corner store. How did you go about getting your first job as a ringer?
Ken Rawlinson, the richest man in Monto, you would not know it. He got around on a bicycle and shorts and scrawny little man on a bike. And he was a money lender and insurance agent and came to the shop, Gwen's shop, to give insurance. And Gwen introduced me and told him what I wanted to do. And he said, well, if he wants a job on a cattle station, you should go and see Sam Nugent. Now, Sam Nugent was a butcher in Monto by now, but his son, Leon, he'd been overseer on Augustus Downs up in the Gulf of Carpentaria when his son, Leon, there was killed in a horse accident. You know, it took me 50 years to work out that I got my first job as a result of a horse fatality. I'd never put two and two together, but then I started thinking about it. But Sam Nugent kindly wrote to the manager of Augustus Downs, and the rest is history. The manager wrote back and said, we'll give you a start, and off I went.
So you travelled out there first by train to Cloncurry and then out by plane. What did it look like from the air, this station?
The station, the first station we stopped at was Camilroy, which was owned by Australian Estates, an English company. It just looked immaculate. It looks wonderful. And I thought, oh, gee, Augustus Downs is going to be even better than that. But when I arrived there, it wasn't. It was owned by Kidman and Brodie, the great cattle king Kidman, and Brodie, who were cattle dealers in Cloncurry. And they didn't put any price on aesthetics. I tell you, everything was functional, corrugated iron. My heart sank, but of course I adapted pretty quickly.
You were employed as a ringer. There were no motorbikes or helicopters in use on stations back then. All the mustering was done by horse, and you'd loved horses as a kid, but how much experience had you had actually riding them?
I'd never ridden a horse before. I'd never sat on a horse before I went to Augustus Downs. Isn't that amazing? Never sat on a
Baptism of
horse.
fire. How did you learn? Who taught you? What happened?
They were pretty good. I mean, there was no tutorials. There's some colourful language, but there's the myth, you know, that they kid the new chum onto the station buck jumper, but one look at me, they knew that wasn't going to work. But you know, I was given a saddle, given a bridle, had a saddle bag on one side and a quart pot on the other. And luckily they gave me a very small saddle with small knee pads, which was great because I learnt balance instead of grip and that. And, got a bit of a tutorial in the yard once or twice. And then after that it was being shouted at. And the shouting made me learn really quick. I knew I was at the bottom of the rung, but I knew I wasn't going to stay there very long. I was going to work my way out from under the bottom of the rung, but it had nothing to do with occupational health and safety. It had to do with not being a nuisance. If you were 70 kilometres out from the homestead at one of the far cattle camps and you got hurt in a horse, you're a real nuisance. So nothing whatsoever to do about my welfare. It was all to do with not creating mayhem by having a bad accident way out in the camp somewhere. So
how does a good stockman hold himself in the saddle?
They're pretty good. It's a bit of a pretty good. They were good riders. They were. There were no chicken wings, arms flapping out, hands always low in the pommel, and standing up, 3-point riding all the time. Standing up in the stirrups, trotting to cover long distances. Taking your weight off the the rear of the horse is the motor, and the front feet are the shock absorbers, and so taking your weight off the rump, standing up in the irons, forward, travelling long distances, trotting if you had to. So yeah, they were good riders, really good riders.
And what was the kind of correct attitude to have towards your horse? What was the right way to treat these animals you were working with?
Look, I only once later on another station saw a person who wasn't a good horseman mistreating a horse by jerking its mouth around, but you never blamed the horse. I never, ever heard anyone blame a horse. I mean, there are plenty of times we were frightened, plenty of times I was restless at night knowing, oh, geez, I've got to ride Pasha tomorrow morning, oh, my goodness, And you couldn't dodge them, by my second year there, I had 16 horses in my string. The day I arrived there, I had 6 horses. That was hard. That was pretty hard for them to find 6 quiet horses. There are 300 working horses, and to find 6 that were suitable for a new chum like me was pretty hard. But I worked my way out of those, and by the time my second year there, I had 16 horses, and you couldn't dodge a tough horse. You'd be in the yards and drafting the horses, and someone would say, "Oh, quite a while since I've seen you on Pasha, Rolly. Do you think you should take him this time?" And I said, "Oh, my heart is sick. Yeah, take."
But it was never the horse's fault, hey? It was always up to the rider.
Never blame the horse. Never blame the horse. That was sort of. It wasn't spoken, but it was the golden rule. If you couldn't get a horse to do something, it was your fault, not the horse's fault.
The station was your base. How often would you be away, though, at different bush camps? What was the rhythm of that?
Most of the year. So we'd be away for a month, and then we'd collect steers and bring them back. There were 3 paddocks on Augustus Downs. They reached 60 square miles. There's a bullock paddock, a spade cow paddock. That's a cow that's been sterilised, a spade cow paddock, a steer paddock and a bullock paddock. But the rest was always one big run. A lot of it wasn't fenced.
Where was your favourite place to camp out?
Just Disraeli by far. It was way back high in the Ironstone Range country.
What was special about it?
It's stunning. On the crystal clear sandy creek, we'd ride out in the morning, and sometimes we'd be riding along the river in the early morning. The crocodiles would be out getting an early morning sunbake, and then I'd hear this plop, as one plopped into the water as we rode along, and then you could see the water lilies swaying as it's swimming out, and then it'd come to the surface, just 2 eyes and a snout looking at, and it was a wonderful place, and the reptiles and a beautiful place.
And what was your sleeping setup out on camp?
Rolled a swag out just rolled a swag out because it was the dry season, and the cook had a fly, a bit of canvas over stretched over a bough held up between 2 fork posts. Every camp had that, and every camp had a basic set of yards for the horses, just very basic, just 2 yards where you could draft the daily horses. And to get back to your earlier question, so we'd be out like that for a month, and then we'd bring the steers into the station, change horses, maybe spend 3 or 4 days at the station. We might kill there, so there'd be station meat, and then exchange horses, maybe do some work in the steer paddock for a week, and then out you'd go again for another month.
You mentioned the cook there, Roland. A popular breakfast was burdekin duck. What's this delicacy?
Corned beef in batter.
Oh.
That's the bush humour, We're having burdekin duck for breakfast, yeah.
So out of the camps you're there mustering cattle, how did you go about it? What's the process?
If you imagine a football team, the owners, Kidman Brodie, own the team. There's the management of the team, and then there's the captain coach. So the head stockman was sort of captain coach, although you'd probably call him more captain than coach, And we were the players, and it was something like that. We were also very strong on teamwork. We didn't have any weekend getaways at luxury hotels to talk about team building and bonding and everything like that. But it was never spoken.
You old bush cynic, Roland.
But no. In a sense, I'm not, because it was just part of the deal. No one person can manage 1,000 head of cattle on their own, and it has to be a pretty smooth operation. So of a morning, we'd draft out a morning horse. That was a horse that might buck a bit like my friend Pasha or other horses. So there was a little yard there you could get on them, and everyone would stand around and watch you get on a horse that hadn't been ridden for a year. And some horses wouldn't be, because there were 300 working horses, and some horses might only get ridden once or twice a year. And then you'd draft out a dinner horse. That's a horse that had to be quieter, be able to catch out in the open. So the head stockman say, Joe, you take the horses out to Goose Lagoon and we'll meet you there. So Joe would head off with the afternoon horses to a predetermined spot, and then we'd all ride out far out wide, mostly walk out, do a bit of trotting, right far out, and then muster into that spot and then pick up cattle on the way back. So it was full on.
Not all of that cattle are willing to be herded up. What do you do when there's a bullock that doesn't want to come in? What's the approach?
That happened up the top end where there was a self-fulfilling prophecy. There were very few cattle up in the top end in those ironstone ridges and those long sandy gullies, scrubby gullies between the ridges. There were very few cattle, so we didn't go up there very often. And in other words, the cattle were always pretty wild, and you'd try and muster them, and you'd get a little mob together that had been mustered before, and they'd become the coaches. But then as you tried to get other cattle in and you couldn't get them in, yes, they were thrown, and it was a...
Now, what do you mean thrown? How do you throw
it's
a massive beast like that?
It's easier than you think, but there's a trick to it. It is easier than you think. There's two ways. There's horsebacking, but it takes two people. That's very simple. You just gallop along behind it. The one horse person in front leans over, grabs the tail, and then all of a sudden goes at 90-degree angle, and the beast topples over. The person behind jumps off, and once you lift up the hind leg, the beast is helpless.
I'm going to trust you that's simple, because that doesn't sound simple. One of you grabs the tail and pulls it, and the other one comes from behind and holds its leg up.
Yeah, it jumps off and holds the leg up. Yeah, and then the other bloke gets off, and that is the most easiest way. The other way.
Trouble picking up my cat, so I can't believe it's not simple. But anyway, I'll trust you.
You try it. So the other way, we all did it, was to, if a beast broke off, you chase it flat out, perhaps for 200 or 300 metres, full gallop till the beast gets tired and it turns around and starts charging the horse. And then you just hold your horse back a bit, 4 or 5 metres, and it stops. The beast will stop there, decide to make an escape, and as it does, you jump off your horse, run up behind and grab it by the tail.
Again, it's that bit. You just grab it by the tail. Was it terrifying or exhilarating?
No, just did it. No, it wasn't either. It was just part of what we did.
Just work.
No, just job, yeah. And then, of course, the beast turns around to try and charge you. But as it does, as it lifts one leg off the ground, you pull that tail and flip it, and it comes over. You hold it up, leg up, put the bull strap on it. We all wore bull straps around our chest and ride back. The trick is you got to know where it was when you
go back and get it.
But Les Cockrell, one of the head stockmen, he wore 3 bull belts, and he could throw three cattle, and he'd know exactly where they were, and we'd all go back and get them. I could only throw one, but.
Was it something that took a while to learn, or is it just once you do it, you got it?
No, you just look. Didn't happen in my first 6 or 7 months there, right? But as I got stronger and as I became part of the team, I started doing it. So it wasn't something I did from day one, right?
Explain to me why it was you had to take shifts staying up with the cattle at night.
Well, because the old cowboy films in America where you had 30 head stampeding are based on fact, and cattle that are at the beginning of their time on the road, once they've been droved, once they've been gone on the road for a week or two, they settle down. But you imagine that the spayed cows, as they fattened, the ones that have been sterilised, and the steers, as they grow up, go into the bullock paddock. And then from the bullock paddock, they become steak. They travel from Augustus Downs to the railhead. They drove him from Augustus Downs to Kajabi, which is about 110 miles in those days, I think, so perhaps 150, 60 kilometres. and a 10-day trip to Kajabi. So when you get them together for the first time, they're held in a big wire yard, which is not very secure, huge, just a wire yard with posts. And you've got to go around and sing. If you weren't into singing, you could tell poetry, but you had to...
What do you mean? Why have you got to sing or recite poetry?
So there's no surprises about noise. If a wallaby or something comes charging along and hits the fence and spooks them, so you've got to make a noise. Yeah, you can't just ride around silently and pretend you're not there.
And you're just getting them used to that sound.
Getting them used to being on the road, quietening them down there. So it takes about 3 days. We'd have them in a wire yard, and one night they rushed there, and it's horrific. I wasn't on watch at the time, but they broke off Coolibah posts, the thickness of telephone posts. They just broke them off at ground level. About 4 posts broken, and those steers that hit those posts, were injured and had to be shot. But the rest just went bang, and we had to muster them all again the next day.
On those nights that you were there on night shift, riding around under the stars, either singing or saying poetry, what was it like? Was it?
Oh, it was lovely. Yeah, lovely. Just fabulous. Yeah, the cattle didn't criticise my voice at all. It was lovely. What's the saying? Sing as if nobody's listening. It was terrific. And then, of course, I was very, very lucky towards the end of my first year. The drover was short, Logan Booth, short of a person. Someone hadn't turned up. So Reg Nissen, the station manager, allocated me to go on the droving trip. So I was very, very lucky.
When the time came to hand the mob over, how were the animals counted?
Well, I always thought, Jesus, they'd be within 10 or 20 or something like that, but they were down to the exact number.
They'd count each individual.
Yeah, and
animal.
What happened was it was pretty to watch actually. So all us ringers, 8 and 9 of us, would hold a big mob, and then we'd run them between the manager and the drover, who had their own systems of counting. They didn't have a pen and paper or anything. They used their fingers, for tens, and then they'd get to hundreds, and they'd go trot the other hand to go to hundreds up to the thousands. And then if they were running too fast, then they'd close in together, and so we'd then hold back. Not a voice, not a word spoken. We just knew that we'd hold back and widen out so the cattle didn't go in so fast. If they're going too slow, we'd come in and push them a bit. And then on the other side, there'd be 2 or 3 other people holding them as they come out the other side.
It sounds like a giant ballet or something.
Oh, it was beautiful. Yeah, it was pretty
Roland.
to watch. Yeah, it was pretty.
And it was silent because these 2 men are counting in their heads to check they agree on the number.
Yeah. So it was that sort of part of the teamwork, totally unspoken, and so it was very nice, yeah.
Could you pick up radio stations out there?
We did, and ABC was big in our lives, but it was mainly when Ken Pute was head stockman. So Ken, on a Saturday night, he had this old radio Bakelite. You don't come across it. It was early plastic, and it had these varicose veins of paint all across it and everything like that. But on Saturday night, Ken would get out his old radio, and he had a long coil of plasticised wire. We'd tie a rock to it. He'd tie a rock to it, throw it up high over a branch, and then fiddle with the tuner. We'd all pull our swags up, half rolled, and sit there, and we'd get ABC long reach, country and western choice program.
So requests coming in from other stations?
Yeah, requests, and someone from Dalganelli would write in, and Ken Pute say, "Oh, yeah, he's one of my good mates. Oh, I know him, Yeah, good mate, all right. You hadn't seen him for 20 years. But, that was the life. People came and went, But all of a sudden, in that vast outback, there we were all connected, connected right across the Gulf, right across into the Barkly Tableland, right down to Western Queensland. We're all connected, all listening to our songs of unrequited love and drovers crossing flooded streams and children dying, and
all the country music classics.
All the tearjerkers. Yeah.
Did you ever write in, Roland?
No, I didn't. Just listened. Yeah.
How important were Aboriginal stockmen to the life of the station?
Oh, they were critical, but One of my great regrets is that I didn't get to know them better.
Is that
But
because people were,
it was
their lives were
apartheid.
kept separate? Apartheid?
Total apartheid. They had their own camp. They had their own sheds about 400 metres from us, little tin sheds. They came over to the kitchen with their plate and got served, whereas we sat at the dining table. In camp, they would come up with their plate to the camp and take it back to their camp. And I didn't get to know any of them. It was just two different worlds. And there was no sort of teaching or learning about interacting with them or anything like that. They
Or
were
understanding their history, I'm imagining, or their ownership.
Dreadful. And I worked probably with one of the last of the Mingan people, old Davy, a grand man who had an incredible history, and worked alongside him. In fact, he and Johnson, the other Aboriginals, saved my life.
Tell me that story. What happened?
We were up the top end, and everyone took off after cattle. I took after this young bull. It was a bull about 3 years of age, and a scrubber bull. Had been uncastrated. He'd never been branded. So and a scrubber bull that in the prime of his life, must have been about 3 years of age. Almost full adult bull. Took off after him, and when he stopped, jumped off my horse, grabbed him by the tail, and I couldn't get him over. He just sort of stood there with both legs square on the ground, turning around, trying to horn me with his horn. So I got him at the very tip of the tail to get as much leverage as I could, and I pulled down and out, to get him over, and he just managed to get his horn under my leg and up to my groin and throw me high in the air. And when I came down, he was grinding me with his horns into the dirt. And I thought it was all over. Seriously, I did. And then all of a sudden, old Davy and Johnson rode up out of nowhere and rammed their horses into the bull, and off he took off. And I just walked up to my horse, got on, and they didn't even talk about it that night around camp. It wasn't even drama, just a day's work.
You ended up spending 2 years, 2 full mustering seasons at Augustus Downs, and then went on to another station in Western Queensland until you listened to your mother's pleading and came back to Sydney and enrolled at Hawkesbury Agricultural College and ended up making a different kind of life for yourself. It's funny how some years matter more than others in our lives. In the big scheme of your life, this time as a ringer was only a brief period. But how significant when you look back over your life?
Oh, well, look, I think a lot of people can remember those formative years of their life. It can shape the rest of your life, and of course it's shaped mine. I'm still passionately interested in horses. I've got 3 horses of my own. I teach horse riding. I go riding down the Snowy Mountains. I'm still passionately interested in horses and people and agriculture. Yeah, I live it in my head, I suppose, but in many ways the head is what the head shapes us, makes us do what we do, doesn't it?
Sounds like it lives in your heart as well, Roland.
It does, yes.
Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Roland Breckwoldt was my guest on Conversations today, and Roland's memoir about his time as a cowboy is called The New Ringer. Big thanks, as always, to the Conversations team, executive producer Carmel Rooney, and producers this week Maggie Morris and Tamar Cranswick. I'm Sarah Kanoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.